Welcome. This is the third test presentation of the Swiss cheese model for accident prevention applied to issues of police violence. And we're pleased here to have as our guest Linda Jenkins of the Jenkins Consulting Group of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And you do a variety of things, including dealing with community groups and other organizations, understanding issues around culture, gender, race, etc. And I'll let you have a couple of minutes to explain what you all do and how we here, myself, can help you with the tool that we've developed. Go ahead, Linda.
Thank you. The Jenkins Consulting Group has expertise in board governance for nonprofit organizations, strategic planning, and unconscious bias training. The unconscious bias training focuses on the techniques and strategies that individuals and organizations can use to disrupt their bias and help them create more inclusive workplaces to benefit them, the individuals in those workplaces, as well as the outcomes and results for the organizations themselves. Because we all know and understand that when people are working in an inclusive environment that values and allows all of the contributions and innovations to occur, have better results. And that's particularly important to me in the context of working with mission-driven organizations, especially those that are focused on creating social change.
And a very brief, thank you for that, and a very brief introduction from my side. Aaron Todd Curtis of airsafe.com, and we deal with aviation safety issues, both presenting information for the public and understanding risk. And that is the core of what we're doing here today. As a result of what's happened since the death of George Floyd, one of the responses I had is, how can I, with my kind of expertise, contribute to making things better? And that contribution is taking a basic risk assessment, systems engineering, and system safety tool that I've used for years, that's been used for years in the aviation industry and elsewhere, to try and understand specific systemic problems. And the systemic problem I'm looking at here is excessive deaths and injuries due to policing, specifically a routine situation, traffic stop, pedestrian stop, that ends in the civilian being seriously injured or killed where there was no need for it, where the person is nonviolent, it doesn't have a weapon, non-threatening, etc. Yet the way the system operates, it ends up with a result that's unacceptable to all. And with that, I'd like to do a little screen sharing here. And that is the wrong screen. Let me get the right screen here. Okay. All right. And you're looking at the documentation I send out ahead of time. And when I do these meetings, what I like to do is to send to the participants a document that lays out what the process is. We don't have enough time during this session to go through the entire process because the intent is to introduce interested persons and organizations with the concept, give them enough information both in the presentation and in the written documentation so they can take this and run with it themselves, that they can adapt this for the particular situations that they're facing and make it useful for them. And by the way, Linda, can you see the top of it here, using the Swiss cheese failure model to reduce excessive police violence?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Oh, let me remind you also, in the chat box there, please feel free to type any comments at any time that you think might be helpful. Advice to make this better, points that were missed, etc. Because in addition to capturing what we're doing by audio and visuals, I'd like to capture what's happening in the chat room. Now, the document that we have here has a variety of things, including a background of what this is all about and examples of how this is used. And let me just go straight to the meat of the matter. What is the Swiss cheese model? Basically, it's a model that's been developed over several decades. One of the biggest proponents is a British researcher named James Reason, who over 30 years ago wrote any number of books and papers over the past 30 years about system failures and system accidents. and how the human aspect of a system, however complex, is often key to keeping things from happening. And it's called the Swiss cheese model because, as you can see, we have this graphic here where the red line is the sequence of events that happen. The slices are protective measures that are in place, either technological, human, procedural, etc., that keep bad things from happening. And if things go wrong, every one of those protective measures has a weakness, the holes in the Swiss cheese. And the process can progress all the way through from a normal beginning to an abnormal end. Now, in the documentation, we do have references to some of the places where this has been used, primarily one key document from the FAA. And this is a generic description of it. James Reason has his model. For example, we have the first layer being organizational influences, second, supervision, third, pre-existing conditions, and fourth, specific actions. In aviation, my experience with this has been, we take this basic idea and adapt it for the situation. Here's a situation I adapted it to. Here is a scenario: a routine pedestrian stop of a police officer, one or more police officers, of a civilian. Routine in the sense of, for whatever reason, the police have a reason to stop and question a person. If there's nothing going on, if there's no crime being committed, if the person is innocent, it should be a routine thing and everyone goes along their merry way. All too often, whether the civilian is completely innocent or maybe a suspect of some sort, how it should not end is with that civilian seriously injured or dead. In the case of George Floyd and others, one of the things that struck me was that the police were behaving in ways that were mostly consistent with their training, with the rules and regulations. I can't speak to what's in the heart of a police officer or whether they have evil intent, but at least the organization they're a part of, the rules and regulations they were following, the procedures they should have followed were such that the safety of the civilian is uppermost, even if they were guilty as sin. How I modeled it was, we start with a routine police stop. We have one layer, which is the law enforcement organization. How do they select police officers? How do they train them? How do they manage them afterwards? The second layer is the police officer or officers in the field. Their decisions and actions prevent bad things from happening, in theory. The third layer is the civilian decisions and actions. And the fourth layer is the officer responding to that civilian. Looking at this model, I thought to myself, the weakest part of the model is the civilian decisions and actions, because the other three layers have a formality to them. There are people who have thought, in some cases over decades, how to make those slices happen. How do you select officers? How do you train them? How do you manage them? What are the techniques an officer should use in the field if something goes one way or if it goes another way? What was lacking for most people is a formal or informal sort of process for how do you deal with a police officer stopping on the street. Now, let me digress for a moment. I know for a fact that both Linda and I grew up in societies where people drove a lot, and being a pedestrian wasn't that popular. So I grew up from observation and from driver's ed, etc. How do you respond if you're pulled over by a police officer for a traffic stop? Now, whether I was speeding or whatnot, or whether I wasn't doing anything wrong, I knew there was a certain rhythm to it. License, registration, proof of insurance, sir, do you understand what you're doing? That sort of thing. I know that kind of back and forth can happen. And in the many times I've been pulled over, many times I didn't have any excuse. I was speeding or I ran the stop sign or whatever, but very rarely have I been given a citation. I'm not anything special, except that I kind of knew how to play the game. If I were walking down the street, let's say a stop and frisk situation in New York City a few years ago, I wouldn't have known how to respond because, frankly, I'd never thought about it. I don't hang around with people who show me all the time, hey, if you get stopped by the cops walking down the street, here's what to expect. Frankly, I was in the dark on this sort of thing. So if I were stopped on the street, I would be extra nervous because I frankly don't know. So this little exercise taught to me that here's something I never thought about. I never thought about how to react if I'm a pedestrian stopped by a cop. Having an aviation background, I thought, well, gee, what do we do in aviation? What does a pilot do when there's a normal or non-normal situation that needs a formal response? Well, you have a checklist. So let's go back to sharing the screen, and I'll go to the checklist. And what I did is I sat down and I wrote a checklist, fairly detailed checklist. I thought to myself, you know, I would never have thought this through as much if I didn't sit down and reason with myself. If I were to write a checklist for someone who knows nothing about how police operate with your pedestrians being stopped, if they knew nothing, what should they know? And some of the basic things is, which I knew in the back of my head growing up. And Linda, you and I both grew up in a time when there were a lot of protests on campuses, including our campus, about investments in South Africa. And one of the things about the South African experience was they had something during apartheid called the pass laws. If you were a person of African descent in South Africa, you had to carry on essentially an internal passport all the time. And if you didn't have it, you might be arrested. Well, one of the things that stuck with me is that, hey, we don't have rules like that in America. I don't have to carry ID with me. If I'm walking around minding my own business, I don't have to prove I am who I am. And believe it or not, that's still the case. If you're a pedestrian, you don't have to carry an ID. But here's where things get a little bit of a wrinkle. Does that also mean that you don't have to tell the cops who you are if they ask? Well, here's the problem I found out putting this checklist together. It depends. Some communities, some states, you do have to. Some communities and some states, you don't. No one ever taught me. And here's an example of someone who was probably never taught either. This happened late August this year in San Antonio, where I grew up. An African-American man was jogging down the street, minding his own business. The cops thought he looked like a person who was accused of a domestic violence situation nearby. They stopped him and asked him who he was. Things went somewhat sideways, and he ended up being arrested by the cops and charged with 2 felonies for resisting arrest. And from the initial response of the police, it seems as though there might have been confusion even on the police side as to whether or not he had to produce ID. Point of fact, in the state of Texas, you don't have to produce ID. And in fact, you don't even have to say what your name is to the officer if they stop you on the street. How this will play out, I don't know. But this is a perfect example of how a normal routine incident, this person was innocent, this person was unarmed, this person was initially not threatening for whatever reason, but somehow or another, things ended up with him being put into a police car, put in jail for 2 days. So far, there is some goodness to the story. All the felony charges were dropped, but this isn't over yet. So I've basically gone through a quick run through of the documentation that goes out to all the meeting participants, including some background resources at the end, which we can get into later. But at this point, having gone through this, I'd like to turn it over to you, Linda, and get your responses and feedback to what you've seen here.
I think I have a fundamental perspective question to begin, because in reviewing the materials, my perspective is that these materials are making an assumption that the behavior of the civilian is the driving factor with regard to the nature of the experience. In that, if a civilian does everything correctly, then the civilian will not have any difficulties in interacting with police officers. And I believe, based on my understanding of historical interactions, that many of the situations that have been brought to our attention are ones in which people of color have responded in alignment with the checklist that you've outlined, but they have still been put into situations that have created harm for them. And I think that the difficulty in reviewing and understanding the utilization of your materials as they've been laid out doesn't allow for understanding with regard to how police officers are responding to the interactions of the civilians that they are working with. I mean, it seems as if the philosophy that's being communicated is if civilians behave in a particular way, that their behavior can dictate the outcome. And I believe that time and time again, it's been demonstrated that civilian behavior in a particular way is not necessarily the driver in determining what the outcome of the situation is going to be.
And thank you for that. And while you were saying that, I was trying to type those as fast as I can so I won't forget them. Those are absolutely legitimate points, and I'm glad you made them. And again, I don't want to fit everything into an aviation square peg into a round hole situation, but I'm going to go from my experience using this kind of approach in that you're absolutely right. You can do all the right things and wrong things can still happen. The normal behavior, quote unquote, of law enforcement agencies and the normal behavior of way too many law enforcement officers often put people of color in positions they shouldn't be. One would say often that's because they're people of color, and let's assume that to be true. I'm also assuming the following about the entire project I'm doing here. This is a risk management situation. And the three things that can happen when managing risk: you can create a situation where it never, ever happens again. You'll never get a bad outcome. You can create a situation where the bad outcome is less likely, and a situation where the bad outcome, if it happens, there'll be fewer bad effects. Well, the first and the third aren't really realistic here, because unless you get rid of policing and police organizations, you will always have this as a possibility. And the latter, that is, being less seriously injured or less dead, again, although that's might be a valid approach, I'm more of the, how can you make this less likely to happen? And you're absolutely right. The current construction of many police departments and how police departments approach many communities are such that if you happen to fit a certain profile, person of color in a poor neighborhood dressed in a certain way, and the police officers from a certain background, those assumptions feed into how they respond, and they may respond quite differently if that weren't the case. That said, I still think there's some value in just pointing out that here is something where we clearly have a problem. And there might be several parts of that problem. If I were a parent, a community group, whatever, and I say to myself, where can I affect things? If I had the opportunity to present this to a police organization, they would rightfully probably focus on management and tactics of the police officer. If I gave this to a community organization, they would approach it from what are the laws, what are the regulations, what are the things that are taken as normal in this community. And from another perspective, it's like, all right, what can I do to make it less likely that I'll be a victim? Doesn't guarantee anything, just makes it less likely. So with that, here's one last aside, which I'll add, which is a personal aside. I happen to reside in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They have a rule here that says you don't have to have proof of insurance in your vehicle. Only place I've ever lived where that was the case. And for a long time, I didn't have proof of insurance in my vehicle because, hey, it's Massachusetts. I don't need to go through the hassle of printing out that and putting it in my glove compartment. And then I just sat back and thought for 5 seconds and thought, look, I'm close to the state of Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New York, what have you. If I hop in my car and ride across the border, instantly I'll be in big trouble if a cop pulls me over and says, sir, license, registration, proof of insurance. I've only got 2 out of the 3. And yes, I can whip out my phone and show my insurance by logging into the website. But if I'm in the middle of a rural area and there's no internet connection, I'm seriously out of luck. So here's a situation where I could be totally following the rules in one jurisdiction. I cross the line and I'm not following the rules. So my thought was, let me play it safe. I'll stick proof of insurance in the car. No matter where I happen to hop in the car and ride, I'm okay. But going through a process like this might make a person realize, hey, here's a couple of things I can do different. It's not going to guarantee anything. But if I do this one or two things different, I'm less likely to get into a bad situation. So your comments are absolutely on point, but I still think that this has some utility to move individuals, groups, or society in a direction where this bad outcome is somewhat less likely.
But how is this different than the talk that most parents of children of color have with their children, especially their male children, and that we're taught, and that we are in a position? I mean, how is this? You're only. I think the frustration is looking at this material and feeling that there are two human groups involved here, and that this doesn't move the needle in the context of believing at this stage in our society that the group the group of humans that need to be addressing their response are police officers and police organizations, and not civilians. In that there have just been too many situations where it's been documented that your checklist has been followed, and it still resulted in adverse outcomes. It's just a frustration as a community so if I put myself in the position of the community organizations that I work with, my response would be folded arms, in the position of saying, we're tired of talking to ourselves and looking at ways in which we change our response. And for want of a better way to put it, we're tired of looking at ways in which we have to conduct and police ourselves with regard to what our responses are going to be when we're interacting with public safety organizations, and say they need to look at what they're doing. And if you can't bring me some philosophy that says that it's going to look at what their responses are, then I don't feel like I have a need to look at what you have to provide me, because I've already got checklists. I've already got the talk. I mean, we already have, we walk around with the, checklist from the ACLU in our back pockets, and understanding what our rights are in the context of a police encounter. We keep it in our glove box. We keep it in our wallets. We keep it in our purses. We know what our responsibilities are. The problem is, what are the responsibilities of the police in interacting with us? And I just don't see how this would contribute to creating a better situation for us if it's not addressing what the police are doing.
You're absolutely on point. What I put together does not address the policing. However, in defense of what I was doing, and this is only the starting point. This is one example I use just for purposes of showing that this is how the process works. Take the pedestrian stop civilian aspect out of it and replace that very same scenario with police responses over local laws. The same sort of process, I believe, has value. That is, can you systematically get into a situation where you can get the stakeholders together and say, look, we came together and we found that this is an issue. We think that replacing this cheese slice, not really effective because we've been doing this for years. We want to address this cheese slice over here. Now, will the public safety organization be open to that? Maybe, maybe not. But would the stakeholders as a whole be open to a way that they can take the same template and apply it again and again and again in different aspects of this whole process? Again, looking at my aviation experience, when a plane crashes or comes close to crashing, There's a whole bunch of things that had to go wrong in the wrong way at the wrong time. And resolving those, nothing will resolve all of them. If you have your standard major accident investigation, there might be a probable cause statement saying, here's what happened and why it happened. Then a list of recommendations or requirements saying, look, this procedure changes, this technology should change, this kind of palliative interaction should change. And they're not all going to be applied. And there might be resistance from one part or another of the system to making those changes happen. Or some of the changes might have to be literally generational in nature. It may take years to change one of those cheese slices, but we still have a responsibility, at least in aviation, to identify those issues, identify what can bring a positive result, and work on them simultaneously, sequentially, in whatever way possible, so that what we have now will look fundamentally different from what we're going to have in the future.
And I can certainly understand that, but the scenario that you just described, Aaron, in your example, actually has checklists or procedures that would relate to the 4 pieces of the cheese. But what you've shown me this morning only shows me changes in procedures for 1 slice of the cheese. And I think that therein lies the frustration in looking at the model as an example of presentation, in that I feel in having the experience of looking at it, that the finger is only being pointed at 1 piece of the cheese, 1 slice of the cheese, and that in reality, you really can't change this scenario to get better outcomes unless there is an equitable look at all 4 slices of the cheese. And that, I just don't feel that you're creating a probable system approach if it's not one that can be executed in the context of responsibilities for all 4 slices of the cheese.
So let me see if I can encapsulate what you just said. My scenario looked at 1 slice of the cheese, and you're saying it would be better for a demonstration, better as a template, if you looked at all the slices of the cheese, or at least try to attempt to explain to folks who are going through the training session, look, this isn't something that's only for 1 slice of the cheese. This isn't something only for people or for technology or for the police department or for civilians. Here's how it can work here, 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 and here. Am I saying that right? Or I'm going to try and write this down.
Yeah, I think so, Aaron, because, and I think that's how I would understand it. And, when I teach project management, I understand the concept.
Okay. So
I think that in going back and doing, postmortems, or your post assessment of any type of project that you've done, you have to be able to look at discrete actions that happen throughout the process that involved multiple people, multiple time periods, you have to be able to look at all of the perspectives that are relevant to the stakeholders that were engaged in the project. And I think you can't just pull out 1 piece and say that only examining or providing guidance with regard to a different response to 1 piece is really going to be a workable, I don't think it's a workable approach from the standpoint of really changing the system's design.
So let me put this out to you. If the supporting documentation were to include exactly what you said, something that addresses either every major stakeholder, preferably both, every major stakeholder and every slice of the cheese, this would be a more effective, potentially a more effective training tool.
Yes, but then you'd also have to say in what context is it an effective training tool? Because is it something that you could give to communities that said if you wanted to look at this as an option for community engagement between police officers and community organizations, then this is a framework that you could use. If indeed the police were willing to put in their responses and have them put on the table from the standpoint of saying, if you can meet us halfway, i.e., you as civilians change X, Y, and Z, then we can change A, B, and C on our side from the standpoint of what we're laying out and what you all are laying out. But in addition, any scenario used in this type of situation, if it does not address the bias of police officers that's being demonstrated by these situations and scenarios where there's clear indication of white people, especially white males, doing activities and engaging with police officers in ways that can be as bad as or worse than cases we have of interactions by black males with police officers, and having different ways in which police officers are treating white men versus black men, then again, this is really hard to look at as a reasonable scenario, because time and time again, we're shown that police officers just take a different attitude and approach to their engagement with white males versus their attitude and approach to engagement with black males. And any scenario that addresses what the procedures should be followed, but the difficulty of putting those in the context of what human behavior actually looks like, it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do.
Well, Linda, I absolutely agree that there are weaknesses in what I was doing. And I think that will be improved if I attempt to do exactly what you say. A, address other aspects of what's going on. B, admit and explicitly state that the bias issues in policing historically have figured into this. And you really can't address this effectively unless you do that. Now, as far as this being a tool to open up dialogue between various parts of the system, between police and community groups, I'm all for that. I think that the kind of improvements you're suggesting will make that more likely. Now, on a technical note, I'm going to stop the recording now because I'm trying to keep the entire process under 40 minutes because I understand that's sort of the limit for free Zoom. And if the community groups are going to do this, I want to show that this can be done, and usefully so, in 40 minutes or less. So thank you very much, and I'll stop the recording now, and we'll continue talking offline, and the improvements will show up in the documentation. Thank you again.
Happy to help.